Morning, everyone, and welcome to our fourth and final session of today's spring workshop. And I say spring workshop as I see snowflakes dancing outside of my windows, but I trust everyone is having a good morning with these programs. And so far, they've been really amazing, each one different, but with that common focus. And so now as we head into our last one, it's my real pleasure to introduce John Snook, retired, I guess fairly recently, from the Brandywine Conservancy, where he was with them for 34 years. John has been an incredible resource for the county, for the network, and a fount of knowledge always very generously shared with all of us. So we certainly, John, look forward to many more years of your wisdom and expertise. He was the principal author of the PALTA, now We Conserve PA conservation tool called Local Regulation of Historic Resources. And he's written numerous local regulatory provisions in that regard. He has provided review of many development plans with a focus on historic resource and historic landscape preservation. I know, John, you were heavily involved with the Craybilly Farm and Westtown and various other things that I'm sure a lot of our members are familiar. And prior to working at the Conservancy, he was the first planner at the Chester County Planning Commission to focus on historic resource protection. John has a BA in architecture from the University of California at Berkeley. John, kudos for being an architect and getting out of that business. And a master in architecture and urban design from Virginia Tech, a hokey town. So with that, John, again, my pleasure to introduce you, and we're really looking forward to your program.
Thank you. And I will try to see if the share screen will work. Okay, I'm hopeful that everyone can see this, and I thank Jim for his introduction. I'm also very involved at the municipal level in my own township. I'm in year 14 as a township supervisor in East Bradford Township. So, historic resources in open spaces. You heard earlier about place matters, and the landscape context of place often is open space, even for small urban communities in an area like this that was settled initially as a rural area. And our oldest structures are often from that earlier era. The historic resources themselves, while important, even if they're treated almost as museum pieces, their value is also rooted in their historical landscape context. The historic resources are also important elements of the conservation of open space. They contribute to the critical character of the landscape, and notably the historical character. And I like the saying, conservation includes the barns in the fields and the fields around the barns. And that is courtesy of Heritage Conservancy up in Bucks County. Obviously, historic resources themselves, the structural element of historic resources, is extremely diverse. And it doesn't include entirely static or immobile objects. The protection of those resources, the means that work, are almost as diverse as the resources themselves. And unlike a natural resource like a wetland, historic resources shouldn't be left alone. They require human use and investment to survive. Yet our working landscapes also must remain economically viable, or we will lose them too. And that viability is often augmented through purchase of development rights. For example, when we think of some of the larger open spaces that we know of, or in this case at Thornbury Farm, you have a cooperative market, and you have part of the property has sold conservation easement, part not. And the owner, Randall Spackman, will tell you lots of stories as to what he does to keep the farm going. And it's a wonderful place. And I like this cartoon. Fortunately, most of the time it doesn't look like that, although we all know areas that almost do. Okay, so the key to the places and their landscapes, preserving them both. The first key is a public consensus for conservation, because that's the only way you're going to get local regulation or even local funding to promote conservation. Then there are a variety of tools, and we'll look at some examples using each. Conservation easements, conservation regulation at the local level, and conservation ownership, such as the very well used in this COVID era preserves that Natural Lands maintains, such as Stroud and Cheslin. I know that Jean Spears told you about some of the tools at the local level, and particularly from a planning perspective. And I wanted to underline the importance of the comprehensive plan. And this example from Solbury Township in Bucks County is an interesting one, because they actually, in their comprehensive plan, identified the key open space landscapes they wanted to keep as potential rural historic districts, and sought to get them on or determined eligible for the National Register. So that's an interesting angle of where the comprehensive planning process does not need to be passive when it comes to looking at historic landscapes. The official map is a tool that is used principally to enable public acquisition of lands for public purposes, but it can also be used, as it is in East Bradford Township, as a public policy guide. And all those lands that are in green shades, as well as the gray and brown, either have or are being preserved through purchase of conservation easements or through partnerships with local land trusts, some in cases receiving donated conservation easements. But we now have about 4,000 acres in East Bradford Township under conservation easement, and a lot of them contain historic resources. The easement tool itself is extremely flexible in terms of how it's developed and what does it say, what is allowed once the easement is in place. But once the easement is in place, it's not flexible. It demands protection. It also demands certain expertise, and this is something the land trusts in our area are not only very good at, but they're also very good at helping municipalities that have embarked on their own programs of acquiring conservation easements, such as we have in East Bradford. All but one of our easements in East Bradford is held by a land trust with the township listed as a beneficiary. And we have easements held by all three local land trusts: North American Land Trust, Brandywine Conservancy, and Natural Lands. Funding is the key, and that gets back to that point of economic viability. You can't just preserve things by wishing it. You have to have a means that leaves the property viable at the end of the day. So conservation easements also get into a sticky wicket sometimes when it comes to historical structures versus historical landscapes. It is pretty easy to monitor an easement governing the treatment or the management of a landscape. To say, okay, you are supposed to take those invasives out. No, you're not allowed to cut down that pin oak, etc. With historical buildings, it's very difficult in the easement to proactively mandate the upkeep. And that it's not so hard to mandate in the easement what can and can't be changed. For example, you cannot strip that molding off, but to actually mandate maintenance, which costs money, is difficult without a funding means to do it. Most local land trusts do not like to take historic preservation easements or historic facade easements, for example, because of their management difficulty. But there are land trusts and organizations that are willing and able to do it. But it is another angle where money comes into play. One of my favorite and partially lost larger open landscapes, which is historical in its breadth, is the Brandywine battlefield. And as you all know, I have been involved on behalf of Westtown Township Planning Commission for now several years in regard to Crebley Farm. The first toll plan was denied. The court upheld the denial. It's now in a second plan consideration. It is ongoing. Back to the conservation easement tool, however, a number of years ago, the Brandywine Conservancy promoted, and also they had some partnerships with both townships and with natural lands to preserve what they called the Meeting House Road corridor, which was the remaining open space where the heaviest fighting actually took place. And all those properties on the screen in light gray have been preserved. Spackman is the farm, Thornbury Farm, I mentioned a minute ago, although the upper part of that property, which is white, hasn't been preserved yet. Sandy Hollow was preserved through development. The development to the right of it donated Sandy Hollow to the township as open space. The other easements have been acquired by the Brandywine Conservancy, including the hole in the donut there, Odell, although that took the raising of $10 million to do. So now all of those properties are preserved through either conservation easement or conservation ownership. The Odell is conservation ownership of the Brandywine Conservancy, and Sandy Hollow is conservation ownership of Birmingham Township. Very new in the area of the battlefield. In fact, the last grant was just approved this week that got North American Land Trust and Chadsford Township over the hump with enough money to purchase this property, which will be called Britton Run Preserve. It's in Chadsford Township, abutting the village of Dilworthstown and right across Oakland Road, which is Old Wilmington Pike, from the Britton 1704 house. It will be preserved in perpetuity, and it will be open to the public with interpretive trails eventually. They haven't been developed yet. This is a view down the middle of the property and a view of the pond in the middle rear of the property. The Knott will take ownership soon. Settlement, I believe, is scheduled very soon. So the grants have come from Delaware County, from Chadsford Township, from the current owner, Mrs. Baldino, from the American Battlefield Protection Program of the National Park Service, and from the State Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. So it was a very big effort of Knott staff to put all those grants together. Oh, I should mention also Mount Cuba Foundation So it took a lot to get the well over $3 million in place. And I, of course, am biased because I'm a member of the board of directors of North American Land Trust, or NALT. And I thank them for these pictures. Now, the 1704 house, rather, across the street, has long been preserved by the Brinton Family Association. Yet, right in its backyard, in this view, which is a fuzzy picture, but is looking from the shadow, over the shadow of the trees that are in the top picture right behind the house, down over what is now a nice open view. Well, it's not going to be for long. Coming soon will be a brand new Mercedes dealership, which will be fronting on 202, and the developers have configured it in many ways as best they could to keep open space along Oakland Road and adjacent to the 5-point corner at Dilworthstown. However, they were not required, for example, to really investigate nor propose mitigation of impact to the landscape setting of the 1704 house. That may require impact assessment note as we introduce how local municipalities can influence conservation through their land use regulation, both of the resources as structures and their landscape settings. One is requiring impact assessment. Obviously, there are a lot of other things that can be done, and I'm going to show you a few examples of what has been done in a number of places. The key to the impact assessment, though, is not the pretty book that describes the resource and the impact, but it is the proposed mitigation to the impact and making that stick. And we have seen a number in Chester County alone where mitigation efforts have been successful, not removing impacts, but mitigating or minimizing impacts. How do you make it stick? Well, first of all, you need to be able to establish the mitigation of historic impacts as a qualifying condition for the development. Now, how do we do that when we have to provide for development by right? Well, you will allow certain things by right, and then you allow other things, which might be more attractive to the property owner, as a conditional use, conditioned upon mitigation of historic resource impact. That's putting it rather simply. There are a lot of other issues too to making it stick. Your own ordinance may create problems. You have to have enough flexibility in the process to make it able to work once you've suggested it. And you need to have incentives to do it, which can be a mixture of carrot and stick. The stick, you get this if you do it this way. Now, one thing that's the most important thing to have for any local regulation that often lays by the wayside is an adequate inventory. What's there and how does the regulation apply to it? So when you start to establish regulation, your ordinance can't just say, any historic resource shall be investigated as to impacts and mitigation shall be required. What are those resources? The first thing you have to do is your ordinance has to be linked to a defined inventory. And if you're getting into landscapes, even more so. Obviously, the state historic resource survey forms are one of the, with especially diagrammatical ones like this that show the various structures, are really important. Because another key is what's regulated. Most of the early ordinances in Chester County that started to regulate historic resources, the old inventory back in 1982, they were just dots on a USGS map. what's the dot? And then later, like in East Bradford, that's a piece of our map down in the lower left. We colored the whole property. Well, what's under regulation? The whole property? So it's very important to define what's being regulated, to what your incentives may apply, as well as what isn't regulated, like a non-contributing resource. Incentive provisions for both landscapes and structures really need to be offered because most historical buildings were not built in accordance with standards applicable to zoning today. They're too close to the road. They're too close to each other. Their use is no longer viable. How do they get to move forward without being removed? A lot of townships, some angles is to give a free use. In other words, you save the old building, you get a new one, you get another one. You can have two principal uses on one property. That's not too common, but some ordinances are written that way. Adaptive reuse is common, but the adaptive reuse has to be permitted, like the office building in the old barn in the lower left. Barns are notably at risk because when you remove the agricultural use around them, in the suburbanization of the landscape. And even today for farming, some of the old barns are not as useful for modern farming. So there's needs to be a lot of effort to keep them. An interesting angle, and it has not been used yet. Excuse me a second. In both Westtown and Pocopson townships have developed density bonuses in their flexible development regulations for the preservation of historical landscapes as well as historic structures. Now, in this case, they have simply defined historical landscapes as the landscape surrounding the historic resource. It could stand to be a little better inventoried than that. And what is the best way? Map them the way Solbury did. So it's an interesting approach. They have both bonuses for the landscape protection measured in a minimum number of acres and for protection or a rehabilitation of historical buildings based on square footage, which gets translated into square footage of new development. A lot of municipalities have adopted what we've now for some time called conservation design as a means to permit development in a manner which strives to preserve not only historic resources, but as much as possible their landscape setting. And these standards can take a lot of different angles, and we're going to look at a variety. The PALTA, now We Conserve PA, a number of years ago, did this brochure about conservation development or conservation design, or even growing greener, which various names. And they focused on a project that was actually the first one I was involved with at Woodward Farm in Kennett Township, which resulted, it was the family viewed the land as their retirement package. And you've all probably seen this before, but the ultimate result was the development was permitted at the same density as the base zoning, but using the flexibility of a planned residential development option, but not the density increase, to put the development on a modest amount of the land, leave the rest in open space, and leave the historical structures intact. A very different take is the Delibero Farm in Upper Euclid, which is now owned by the township, was entirely saved because the development value was allowed to be transferred to another property. And that is a very interesting angle or take, if you will, on transfer of development rights without literally having a transferable development rights program in place. Sometimes even your highest density zoning could afford protection of historical landscapes and their relationship to the resources in them. Cherry Creek in Thornbury Township, Delaware County is the highest density zoning in Thornbury Township. The developer here strove to preserve the historical landscape context in the public view, so all the landscape along Dilworthtown Road and around the historical building complex, and put all the development essentially in old soybean fields in the rear. So those pictures to the side of the plan are all post-development. And so even at that highest intensity of development, you still have this in the public view. And so it's not a perfect solution, but it's a lot better than what might have happened. And it took a little bit of a fight with Delaware County planning commissioners, not their staff was supportive, who wanted more roads to come into the tract. Instead, the original lane was kept as an emergency access so that there are two accesses, but we didn't want to bulldoze through that front green with another road just for the sake of having quote unquote two access points. Now, sometimes the economy helps you out. This is a very high dollar area in Upper Makefield Township in Bucks County. And high dollar, though, is often made even higher dollar if the new house sites have a view of permanent open space. So in this case, the value of the property was achieved with simply a limited number of lots for very nice big McMansions, all with a view over this field, also visible from the public view, that is now permanent. Farm View, a much more modest attempt in Lower Makefield, still McMansions, if you will, quite frankly, but simply by having the lot size and putting the houses on half the tract and leaving all the land along the public road views in open space, including near historical buildings. So that was really quite simple, and yet it worked. West Pikeland, I call this one trade-off because there was hard to put any development on this tract without it being in the view, and near historical structures. At the upper right of the aerial view is an historical church. So part of the idea here was to put a small bit of the new development in a little bit of a village format, although it turned out to be rather difficult to do given the McMansions being built today. But all the rest of the open landscapes that were visible from public road and the area around the barns were left in permanent open space. Where did the development go? If you look at the lower part of that picture, you can see the development. It's in the woods. But you'll notice this was not a mature woodland, and you'll notice the woods are not demolished. The houses were fitted in. The roads were fitted in. We asked the engineer to put the road in along the land and do an as-built for the plan of it, rather than just push that cul-de-sac through the woods. So that's difficult to do. You have to get the engineers on all sides to agree, but it was done there. Here's another simple one in Bucks County, also Upper Makefield, Rapuano Farm. they had to get the money out of it. The property went into an estate situation. You'll see the original structure down in the bottom. And actually, there's some up next to the development. It's a rather simple idea of simply putting the same amount of houses on less land, but all the land in the public view was kept open. And the final one I'm going to look at was a little more complicated. Fenimore in Gladwin. This was done by Todd Polick, who provided these drawings. Beautiful old mainline mansion. And everyone knows how Lower Merion is quite tight, yet still has significant landscape open space, if you will, and just the sheer vegetation, the formality of the landscapes in many areas. This is the way the property looked before development. You see the main house and you see the several outbuildings. Well, the base zoning would not have been too kind to this property. Fortunately, a number of alternatives were examined. The one that was selected put away some of the development on an existing secondary road access. You'll see that string of 5 houses, which married them visually into an existing neighborhood. Now, this still looks like a lot of development, and these are very large, extensive houses. But what the important thing that was done is, even though some of the new development is in proximity to the historic mansion and its formal garden, the formal landscaping is on the other side of the mansion going toward the public view. And that whole entire forefront in the public view is permanent open space. The road going in bends through the open space so that you don't see any houses right away. You see the landscape, you see the house until you're well into the tract. And I have actually been to a party at someone's house in this development, and the outcome once the landscaping grew up around the houses is really quite amazing. And there you see when it was under construction. However, in the far right side of the aerial, you see a piece of the mansion house and the formal green in front of it, which is still visible from the public road, just like that. And it would be interesting to get a picture that is not 15 years old like this one is, to see what it looks like now, because you'll notice all the neighborhoods around this, they're not devoid of houses, they're just full of trees. So ultimately, all of these methods at which landscapes can be preserved around historic resources, the regulatory ones in some ways are the most complicated, and they really, really require community consensus. If that's your first agenda item, or should be. The other means all take money. And I mentioned the newest one in that regard at Brinton Run Preserve. Multiple grants and a willing landowner, a willing sale, willing to wait for all the grants to get approved. So that won't always work. So I really suggest that you always look at a mix of means. Make sure your local regulation is as promoting as possible in conservation of key landscape and structural resources. Don't allow by right the stuff that's going to destroy it. And my wise owl, he simply says, go to your local municipality, be involved, and be opportunistic. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Share, and we'll begin our Q&A right now. For those who are interested in submitting a question for John after that wonderful program, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type in your question. The first question we have, John, is if you look at Chester County, what particular open spaces would you recommend people visiting to see historic places?
Well, obviously, we have some significant public and private investment that is open to the public, notably the county park system. The Hibernia Park with the Hibernia Mansion and other structures in it and intact landscape. We have the Springton Manor Farm. There are historical buildings in some of the other parks. Of course, the Pennsylvania State Park in Delaware County has the Pennsylvania Farmhouse Complex, Colonial Plantation, I think it's called. That's a state park. Now, we also have, of course, our national parks, national historical parks, notably at Valley Forge and also up in the northern part of the township at, I just suddenly escaped me, the old Forge. It's an enclave in French Creek State Park, but it's a national historic. Hopewell Village, yes. Now, we also have preserves, many of which are open to the public, such as the ones owned by Natural Lands. Notably, here in the Westchester area, the Stroud Preserve and the Cheslin Preserve. The Stroud Preserve does have an historical building complex in the middle. And all of these are walkable. Some of them are rideable for equestrians. We also have trails now, more and more, that often go through or past historic resources. The best ones so far are not that much in the vicinity of historic resources, although the Chester Valley Trail, for example, will be extended into Downingtown before long. Our Brandywine Trail in East and West Bradford, the buildings along it were essentially removed and they weren't particularly historic. There are remnants of mill sites. But there are lots of places one can go. And then many private properties are, certainly, for example, on Chester County Day, that's a fantastic way to see a lot of historical buildings in their landscape context and also get to go inside them. Sites like the Brinton 1704 house are open occasionally. The Laurels Preserve owned by the Brandywine Conservancy is not open to the general public. It's open to membership. However, the property at Birmingham Hill is eventually anticipated to be made available to the public, although there aren't very many historical buildings left or on it. So, it's a mix and match issue, obviously. I think that's probably enough.
The second question, John, is you had mentioned parks and public monies being used to save some of these historic structures. What if a community doesn't have public money coming in? What avenues would you recommend that they follow up on in order to raise the money to preserve these historic places?
Well, first of all, every municipality in Pennsylvania has the ability under Act 153 to enact an open space funding program, which can be focused on historical landscapes and landscapes including structures. So that's where the building the public consensus or the public will comes into play. The voters have to enable a tax, a local tax. In East Bradford, for example, our tax is 1/4 of 1%. That's an earned income tax. It doesn't have to be. It can also could be a standard property tax. We felt that the earned income tax was more fair. It's more able to pay related. 1/4%, that's $250 for every $100,000 you make. So as you can see, it's really not very much money. In our case in East Bradford, it raises over $1 million a year. That money only goes toward open space purchases, which have included buildings. The one building most recently acquired, unfortunately, was starting to fall down. It was a barn. We were able to transfer it to a willing buyer who is stabilizing it. And that's part of the deal. So there is money. Now, the other thing is grants. Obviously, any municipality, or even like I mentioned, NAL, North American Land Trust with the Brinton Run Preserve, if it's a nonprofit, you know, a 501c3 nonprofit, can apply for grant funding. Partnerships are great. In this case of the Brinton Run Preserve, Chadds Ford Township is not only being a partner and contributing funds toward the ongoing management of the property, they also have applied for and received a grant from Delaware County for $500,000 that is going into the acquisition fund. So it's not easy. It's harder for municipalities to get funding from private foundations, but a nonprofit working with a municipality may. I was meant to put a picture in here and I didn't, of the old mansion at Radley Run. The people living in the vicinity have set up a new 501c3 called the Radley Run Mansion Foundation. And they are looking at ways potentially to partner with Birmingham Township to gain funding for the rehabilitation and the viable adaptive reuse of that mansion house. So scratch your heads. My final remark of be opportunistic, I think, is key. And if you don't have a good grant writer, borrow one.
We have a note coming in here from Nyla. Nyla said Frick's Locks Village Schuylkill River Trail is open during season. That she wanted to share that with others. And John,
thank you, Nyla.
Rob is saying Northeast Chester County, East Town, Schuylkill, different townships is said to be fully developed. This results in tear down as development. What open land strategies and tactics could you recommend? I think you've touched on several of these. Do you want to highlight any additional ones for Rob?
I think it is very case specific, and I know exactly what he's talking about. I helped Malvern Borough adopt new zoning language last year. Yeah, last spring. Just before COVID hit. And Malvern, of course, is more dense than the surrounding townships, but it's seeing the same pressure. The train station's right there. It was originally built with a fairly large number of small bungalow-style houses. Those are turning into teardowns and new McMansions, replacing them. McMansions that are out of character with the historical townscape in that case. So we wrote some new zoning provisions to limit the square footage and the height of the new McMansions unless they were respectful of the neighboring landscape settings. In other words, if they set back more, if they just went to the minimum 5 feet from the lot line, no. You can't be 35 feet high, you can only be 18 feet high. So we put some restrictions in. Obviously, it's not perfect, and that's an example, very explicitly developed for a fairly small, nearly urban, if you will, landscape. But obviously in Tredyffrin, certainly in Schuylkill, there are still some significant open properties left. Some of them are being developed somewhat creatively. The key is to have the ordinance in place to push for how the redevelopment occurs when you get a tear down. Most of the tear downs are, unfortunately, or for better or for worse, are going to happen at the level of lot by lot, one lot that already has a house. But you can still have design standards that are applicable. Obviously getting a developer like Todd Polig, who has the will and the market scenario to permit a creative approach is good when you have a larger property. And there are, in a lot of the valley part of Tredyffrin, you still have some larger properties. It's also where the township zoning is the least dense. Easttown too. You're right though. There's not much available except tear downs, especially in Tredyffrin and Easttown.
And it just highlights, from my standpoint, the importance of being visionary from a township supervisor standpoint in enacting the ordinances that are needed to help these historic properties. Daniel is saying, can nighttime light pollution be regulated near historic buildings or district areas? My historic farmhouse is at the east end of Oakbourne Road in Westtown, yet the glare from the 202 car dealers at the western sky is outrageous. This is hard to visualize until it's already built.
Oh, you're absolutely correct. Now, however, based on that knowledge, we should be pushing for better lighting ordinances. A lot of municipalities have embraced what's called dark sky. We don't have streetlights in most of East Bradford, for example, although sometimes I think for safety, you want at least some lighting, but it doesn't have to be up on a 50-foot high pole. You probably followed the whole story in Westtown about the proposed lighting of the athletic fields at the Westtown School, which raised quite a bit of fuss amongst neighbors, and I believe was ultimately turned down. Obviously, there's not much we can do to mitigate what's already there, unless, again, if it is open for redevelopment, it's a new land development. And the new land development must comply with any new ordinances that have been developed. So it is very critical that when you say provide for a historic resource assessment, that range of area that you're examining impacts is wide enough to include, for example, lighting impacts. Now you can also, you don't have to provide for 24/7 lighting. You can require after business lighting to go down. Now, you probably can't disallow in every potential spot a 24/7 Wawa, but if it's next to an historic village, that's a logical reason to. I'm alluding to one that I don't know what happened to in Schuylkill Township.
But go ahead, John.
So yeah, that's a very important point. It's important for all of us as we're involved to remember that lighting impacts are real. They're too often overlooked, and like you say, until after they're glaring in your face.
And it's interesting, Daniel's following up saying, yes, the Ruston Stadium lighting was delayed, but still went in about 5 years later. Oddly, the wiring was already pre-installed. And with that, we're going to be closing our 2021 spring workshop sponsored by the CCHPN. We hope you have enjoyed each of the 4 programs we presented this morning. Our special thanks to John Snook for providing us with exceptional presentation on historic places and open spaces. All of us are better prepared to preserve historic places as a result of his information. Like the National Trust, the Chester County Historic Preservation Network is working to preserve our historic resources for ourselves, for each other, and for our future together. We invite you to visit our website, cchpn.org, for information, historic property resources, events, membership, donations. And we wish you a very safe and fabulous spring. And remember, old places really do matter. Thanks so much for tuning in.